March 6, 1944, 1300 hours over Brandenburg, and Oberst Egon Mayer commanding Jagdgeschwader 2 watches through the heavy metal framing of his Messerschmitt Bf-109G-6 canopy as over 800 American heavy bombers droned toward Berlin. But something is different today, because escorting those Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses all the way from England are sleek single-engine fighters with strange bulbous canopies that seem to give their pilots the ability to see everything, everywhere, all at once. And this is the moment the Luftwaffe discovers that the Americans have achieved the impossible, creating a fighter with the range to reach Berlin and a revolutionary bubble canopy that eliminates the blind spots German pilots have relied on for 4 years of aerial combat. The German fighter pilots climbing to intercept don't yet understand that these North American P-51D Mustangs with their teardrop-shaped canopies represent more than just another Allied fighter. They represent a complete transformation of air combat doctrine, because while Luftwaffe pilots struggle to check their 6 o'clock position through the restricted visibility of their heavily framed canopies, twisting their necks and rocking their wings to glimpse what might be lurking in their blind spots, these American pilots sit beneath crystal-clear plexiglass bubbles that provide unobstructed 360-degree visibility, turning the ancient advantage of surprise that German pilots have perfected since the Spanish Civil War into an obsolete relic. Major Wilhelm Steinmann of Jagdgeschwader 1, a veteran with 93 victories, leads his swarm of Focke-Wulf Fw-190A8s toward the bomber stream, confident in the tactics that have served the Jagdwaffe so well, diving from the sun where enemy pilots traditionally cannot see. But as he positions for his attack run, he notices these new escort fighters reacting to his presence while he's still 2,000 meters away, their bubble canopies glinting as pilots swivel their heads. With complete freedom of movement, tracking his approach without the frantic wing rocking and weaving that characterizes defensive flying in aircraft with conventional canopies. The Luftwaffe High Command has been monitoring reports of a new American fighter with exceptional range capabilities, and General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland himself has studied captured examples of earlier P-51B models with their Malcolm hoods, but nothing has prepared them for the tactical revolution represented by this fully developed bubble canopy design, which North American aviation engineers have perfected through new molding techniques that allow them to create a distortion-free teardrop of plexiglass that rises seamlessly from the fuselage, eliminating the heavy metal frames and restricted sightlines that plague both the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and even the more advanced Focke-Wulf Fw-190. Inside the cramped cockpit of his Bf-109G-6, Unteroffizier Hans Dortmann struggles with the same visibility problems that have plagued German pilots since 1939, because the Messerschmitt's narrow cockpit barely allows him to move his head, and the heavy armor plating behind his seat, combined with the metal framing of the canopy, creates massive blind spots that extend across nearly 40% of his visual field, forcing him to constantly roll and weave just to check if enemy fighters are stalking him from behind, burning precious fuel and losing energy in the process. The Focke-Wulf Fw-190 pilots fare slightly better with their larger, more bulbous canopies, but even Kurt Tank's revolutionary design cannot match what the Americans have achieved, because while the Fw-190 provides better visibility than the cramped Bf-109, its canopy still relies on metal framing for structural support, creating blind spots at crucial angles, particularly in the high 6 o'clock position where enemy fighters prefer to attack from, and now these German pilots watch in growing alarm as P-51DS seem to possess an almost supernatural awareness of everything happening in the airspace around them. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring receives the combat reports from this first major escort mission to Berlin with mounting disbelief, refusing initially to accept that American single-engine fighters have not only reached the capital of the Reich but have done so while maintaining enough fuel for combat operations, and his staff officers explain that these new Mustangs carry drop tanks and internal fuel loads that give them over 1,600 miles of operational range. But what truly disturbs the reports is the repeated mention of the enemy's uncanny ability to detect and counter every classical attack approach the Luftwaffe pilots attempt. The technical specifications that reach Luftwaffe intelligence paint a sobering picture, because the P-51D's bubble canopy rises 11 inches above the fuselage line, created from a single piece of formed plexiglass that requires no internal bracing, providing the pilot with completely unobstructed vision through a full 360-degree arc, while German pilots must make do with canopies that haven't fundamentally changed since 1940, still using flat panels held in place by thick metal frames that create numerous blind spots, especially in the critical rear quarters where most successful attacks originate. Lieutenant Wolfgang Spade of Jagdgeschwader 11, flying his Bf-109G-14 at 28,000 feet, attempts to use the traditional German advantage of superior climb rate to position above the American fighter escort, but as he watches through his restricted canopy, he sees P-51D pilots below him constantly scanning the sky, their heads moving freely under their bubble canopies, and when he begins his dive, expecting to achieve surprise, the Mustangs break into his attack while he's still 500 meters away, their pilots having spotted him long before he would have been visible to a German pilot looking up through a conventional canopy. The production numbers reaching German intelligence through neutral Switzerland paint an even more alarming picture, as North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and a second massive facility in Dallas, Texas, are producing P-51DS at a rate that staggers the imagination, with plans for over 8,000 of these bubble canopy variants alone, each one giving its pilot the kind of situational awareness that previously required years of combat experience to develop, essentially democratizing the skills that separate aces from novices. Young Luftwaffe pilots fresh from abbreviated training programs, already struggling with the complexity of aerial combat, now face opponents who can see them coming from any angle, eliminating the possibility of achieving surprise through the careful stalking tactics their instructors have tried to teach them in the few dozen flight hours they receive before being thrown into combat, and these inexperienced pilots, flying aircraft with visibility restrictions that demand constant vigilance and physical contortion just to maintain basic situational awareness, are being systematically destroyed by American pilots who can simply glance around to build a complete picture of the battlefield. Major Heinz Barr, commanding 2/Jagdgeschwader 1, conducts a tactical evaluation after losing 3 experienced pilots in a single engagement with P-51DS, noting in his report that the enemy's ability to maintain visual contact throughout violent maneuvering gives them a decisive advantage in the turning fights that characterize fighter combat, because while his pilots lose sight of their opponents when pulling high G-turns due to the restricted visibility of their canopies, the Americans maintain visual contact throughout, allowing them to anticipate and counter every move with an efficiency that seems almost prescient. The bubble canopy's advantages extend beyond simple visibility, because the increased headroom allows American pilots to wear their parachutes as seat cushions while still maintaining comfortable head clearance, and they can pivot their heads freely to track targets through complex maneuvers, while German pilots in their Bf-109s find their heads hitting the canopy roof when wearing seat-type parachutes, forcing many to fly without proper safety equipment or accept severely restricted head movement that further compromises their ability to maintain situational awareness. Technical officers at the Luftwaffe Test Center at Rechlin examined captured P-51D specimens with a mixture of admiration and despair, noting that the bubble canopy is manufactured using advanced thermoforming techniques that Germany's war-stressed industry cannot hope to replicate, requiring specialized tooling and materials that are simply unavailable to German manufacturers, who continue producing canopies using pre-war methods that involve multiple flat panels assembled with heavy metal frames, each joint and frame member creating another obstruction to pilot visibility. The impact on combat tactics becomes immediately apparent as American fighter groups develop new doctrines that exploit their visibility advantage, with P-51D formations maintaining much looser spacing than German fighters dare attempt, because each pilot can easily track his wingmen through any maneuver simply by turning his head, while German formations must fly in tighter, more predictable patterns to maintain visual contact, making them more vulnerable to concentrated attacks and limiting their tactical flexibility. Squadron leaders throughout the Jagdgeschwader report a disturbing trend in pilot morale, as experienced aviators who have survived years of combat find themselves being consistently outmaneuvered by American pilots with a fraction of their experience. Not because these Americans are superior pilots, but because their bubble canopies give them such enhanced situational awareness that they can track multiple threats simultaneously while German pilots struggle to keep sight of a single opponent through their restricted field of view. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm is hemorrhaging experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate, with loss reports consistently citing the enemy's superior visibility as a contributing factor, and General Gallant himself admits in a staff meeting that the technological advantage represented by the bubble canopy, combined with the P-51D's exceptional range and performance, has fundamentally shifted the balance of air superiority over Europe, transforming the Luftwaffe from hunters to hunted in the skies over their own homeland. The Japanese Army Air Force receives its first detailed reports about the P-51D's bubble canopy through German technical exchanges, and Colonel Satoshi Enabuki, commanding the 50th Sentai, immediately recognizes the threat this poses to Japanese tactical doctrine, which relies heavily on surprise attacks from blind spots, particularly against American bombers. But now these same tactics will be useless against escorts that can see in every direction simultaneously, forcing a complete reconsideration of defensive strategies for the homeland. Meanwhile, in Italy, Maggiore Adriano Visconti of the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, flying alongside Luftwaffe units with his Macchi C-205 Veltro, encounters P-51DS for the first time during a bomber interception over northern Italy and reports with alarm that these American fighters seem to have eyes in the backs of their heads, reacting to attacks before they're even properly initiated, their bubble canopies allowing pilots to maintain visual contact even during the violent evasive maneuvers that would leave pilots in conventional fighters temporarily blind. The Malcolm hood that preceded the bubble canopy on earlier P-51B and P-51C models had already given Allied pilots improved visibility, but the full bubble canopy of the P-51D represents a quantum leap forward, eliminating not just the rear quarter blind spots but providing completely unobstructed vision across the entire upper hemisphere, allowing pilots to track targets through vertical maneuvers that would leave German pilots desperately searching empty sky, having lost visual contact at a critical moment. German pilots report a particularly unnerving phenomenon during combat with P-51DS, describing how American pilots seem to anticipate their attacks before they're even committed, breaking into defensive maneuvers at the exact moment a German fighter reaches firing range, not through lucky guesswork but because the bubble canopy allows them to precisely judge distances and angles of approach that would be invisible to a pilot looking through a conventional framed canopy with its multiple obstructions and distortions. The Luftwaffe's operational training units scramble to develop new tactics to counter the visibility advantage of the bubble canopy, experimenting with coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm the American pilots' ability to track threats. But even these complex tactics prove ineffective against pilots who can simply swivel their heads to maintain awareness of every attacker, coordinating their defensive responses with a situational awareness that German pilots cannot hope to match. Production statistics from North American aviation reveal the staggering scale of American industrial mobilization, with the Inglewood facility alone producing over 6,000 P-51DS, each one assembled by workers who have reduced construction time to mere hours per aircraft through advanced assembly line techniques, while German aircraft production, dispersed to avoid bombing and hampered by material shortages, struggles to replace losses even when building aircraft with conventional canopies that require far less sophisticated manufacturing processes. Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, conducts his own analysis of engagement reports and concludes that the bubble canopy has effectively negated years of tactical development, because all the careful approaches and attack angles that German pilots have perfected assume the enemy has significant blind spots to exploit, but when facing an opponent who can see in every direction, these tactics become not just ineffective but actively dangerous, as they place the attacker in predictable positions where the American pilots expect them. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots becomes increasingly apparent as even veteran aces report feeling exposed and vulnerable when engaging P-51DS, knowing that their every move is being watched and anticipated, eliminating the predatory advantage that successful fighter pilots have always relied upon, the ability to stalk and strike from positions where the enemy cannot see them coming, a fundamental principle of fighter combat since the First World War. Technical intelligence reports from the Eastern Front, where Soviet aircraft still employ conventional canopies similar to German designs, confirm what Luftwaffe pilots are experiencing in the West, that the bubble canopy represents a revolutionary rather than evolutionary advancement, providing such a dramatic improvement in pilot situational awareness that it effectively multiplies the combat capability of every aircraft equipped with it, turning average pilots into formidable opponents and excellent pilots into nearly unbeatable adversaries. Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, commanding the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, reports to Washington that the introduction of P-51DS with bubble canopies has produced a marked improvement in bomber defense effectiveness, with loss rates dropping by over 60% on missions where bubble canopy Mustangs provide escort, compared to missions escorted by earlier fighter types with conventional canopies, demonstrating the decisive tactical advantage that superior visibility provides in aerial combat. The Packard Motor Company, producing Merlin engines under license for the P-51D, reports manufacturing over 15,000 of the supercharged V-1657 engines, each one powering a Mustang that combines exceptional performance with unprecedented visibility, creating a weapon system that exploits every weakness in German fighter design, from the Bf-109's cramped cockpit and restricted visibility to the FW-190's limited high-altitude performance. Advantages that are magnified by the pilot's ability to maintain constant visual awareness. By May 1944, Luftwaffe losses have reached catastrophic proportions, with entire staffline being decimated in single engagements with P-51D-equipped fighter groups, and the survivors report a consistent pattern where German pilots are shot down without ever seeing their attacker, while their own attacks are detected and countered before they can achieve firing position. A complete reversal of the tactical situation that existed just months earlier when German pilots could exploit the blind spots. In Allied fighters, the bubble canopy's impact extends beyond fighter versus fighter combat, as P-51D pilots report being able to maintain visual contact with ground targets throughout attacking runs that would leave pilots in conventional fighters temporarily blind, allowing them to conduct devastating strafing attacks on German airfields with unprecedented accuracy, tracking anti-aircraft positions and obstacles while maintaining awareness of their wingmen's positions, coordination that would be impossible with restricted visibility. Major Johannes Steinhoff of Jagdgeschwader 77, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces with over 100 victories, submits a report stating that engaging P-51DS requires a fundamental reconsideration of fighter tactics, because the traditional advantage of the attacker who chooses the time and angle of engagement has been neutralized by an opponent who can see the attack developing from any direction and respond accordingly, forcing German pilots to accept unfavorable engagement, geometries, or abandon attacks entirely. The Italian co-belligerent Air Force, fighting alongside the Allies with their obsolete fighters still equipped with heavily framed canopies from the 1930s, provides a stark contrast that demonstrates just how revolutionary the bubble canopy truly is, as Italian pilots flying alongside P-51DS report feeling like they're flying blind in comparison, constantly losing track of the tactical situation while their American allies maintain perfect situational awareness throughout even the most chaotic engagements. Japanese naval attaches in Berlin transmit urgent reports to Tokyo describing the bubble canopy technology and its tactical implications, warning that the Imperial Japanese Navy's Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, despite their exceptional maneuverability, will be at a severe disadvantage against opponents who can maintain visual contact throughout any maneuver, eliminating the Zero's traditional advantage in turning fights where pilots often lose sight of each other, allowing superior aircraft handling to determine the outcome. Production engineers at Messerschmitt's Regensburg facility attempt to develop their own bubble canopy design for the proposed Bf-109K variant, but quickly discover that creating a distortion-free blown canopy requires specialized equipment and expertise that Germany's war-ravaged industry simply doesn't possess, forcing them to continue with incremental improvements to the existing framed canopy design that do little to address the fundamental visibility disadvantage German pilots face. The Focke-Wulf Company's attempts to improve visibility on the FW-190D9 Dora variant include a slightly enlarged canopy with reduced framing, but even this improved design cannot match the unobstructed view provided by the P-51D's bubble canopy, leaving German pilots at a persistent disadvantage that no amount of performance improvement can overcome, because in aerial combat, the pilot who sees first typically shoots first, and the pilot who shoots first typically survives. By June 1944, as Allied forces storm the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe can muster only token resistance, with many of its most experienced pilots already lost to the guns of bubble canopy Mustangs, and the few who survive report a profound demoralization among the rank and file, who know that engaging American fighters means accepting combat where the enemy holds every advantage, from superior numbers and performance to the crucial ability to see everything happening around them. General Lieutenant Walter Grabmann, commanding the 3rd Fighter Division responsible for defending central Germany, reports to Göring that the bubble canopy has rendered traditional interception tactics obsolete, because P-51D pilots can track interceptors from the moment they take off from their airfields, maintaining visual contact as they climb to altitude and positioning themselves to counter any attack before it develops, forcing German pilots to abandon careful energy management in favor of desperate slashing attacks that rarely succeed. The impact on pilot training becomes critical as the Luftwaffe struggles to prepare new pilots for combat against opponents with superior visibility. because traditional training methods assume both combatants have similar visual limitations, teaching cadets to exploit blind spots that simply don't exist on bubble canopy fighters, forcing instructors to develop entirely new curricula that emphasize speed and surprise over tactical positioning, a fundamental shift that the abbreviated training programs simply cannot accommodate. Hauptmann Anton Hackel of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran instructor, reports that new pilots are being shot down on their first missions at an unprecedented rate, often without ever seeing the P-51D that destroyed them, because while experienced pilots have developed an almost sixth sense for threats in their blind spots, constantly maneuvering to clear these areas, novice pilots lack these instincts and are easy prey for American pilots who can track them continuously from positions they cannot observe. The bubble canopy's advantages become even more pronounced during bomber escort missions, where P-51D pilots can maintain visual contact with both the bomber stream and potential threats simultaneously, something German pilots find impossible with their restricted visibility, forcing them to choose between watching for enemy fighters or tracking their target, a dilemma that often proves fatal when American escorts attack from the blind spots created by this divided attention. Technical analysis of crashed P-51DS reveals the sophisticated manufacturing process behind the bubble canopy, involving precisely controlled heating and forming of plexiglass sheets over custom-made molds, followed by careful annealing to prevent stress fractures. A process that requires specialized equipment and expertise that took American industry years to perfect, advantages that Germany's dispersed and bombed-out aircraft industry cannot hope to replicate even if they had access to the necessary materials. By August 1944, Luftwaffe pilots joke grimly that fighting P-51DS is like playing cards against an opponent who can see your hand, because every tactical move is immediately visible to the American pilots under their crystal-clear bubble canopies, while German pilots must guess at enemy intentions based on fragmentary glimpses through their heavily framed canopies, a disparity that transforms aerial combat from a contest of skill to an exercise in futility. The Mediterranean theater provides additional evidence of the bubble canopy's decisive advantage, as P-51D squadrons based in Italy systematically destroy Luftwaffe and Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana units despite flying at the extreme range of their operational capability, their pilots maintaining such superior situational awareness that they can engage in prolonged combat without the disorientation that affects pilots who must constantly strain to track threats through restricted visibility. Colonel Hub Zemke, commanding the 479th Fighter Group equipped with P-51DS, develops new tactical doctrines that specifically exploit the visibility advantage of the bubble canopy, including loose formations that would be suicidal for German fighters but allow American pilots to cover much more airspace while maintaining mutual support, tactics that prove devastatingly effective against German formations forced to fly in tight groups to maintain visual contact. Japanese observers with the German forces report with particular alarm on the bubble canopy's effectiveness in ground attack missions, where P-51D pilots can simultaneously track ground targets, defensive positions, and airborne threats, a capability that will prove devastating against Japanese forces accustomed to achieving surprise through careful use of terrain and weather, advantages negated by pilots who can see in every direction while maintaining aggressive attack profiles. The Luftwaffe's jet fighter program, particularly the Messerschmitt Me-262, is partly accelerated in response to the threat posed by bubble canopy Mustangs, with German planners hoping that superior speed might compensate for inferior visibility, but even these revolutionary aircraft suffer from the same framed canopy limitations, forcing their pilots to rely on hit-and-run tactics that prevent them from fully exploiting their performance advantage in prolonged engagements. September 1944 brings fresh evidence of the bubble canopy's impact as American fighter groups claim unprecedented kill ratios exceeding 10-1 against Luftwaffe fighters, with many victories achieved by relatively inexperienced American pilots against German veterans, success attributed primarily to superior situational awareness that allows them to maintain tactical advantage throughout engagements that would leave pilots in conventional fighters disoriented and vulnerable. The Packard V-1657 engine powering the P-51D, combined with the exceptional visibility provided by the bubble canopy, creates a synergy that transcends the sum of its parts, because pilots can fully exploit the engine's performance knowing they can maintain visual awareness throughout any maneuver, pushing their aircraft to the limits without fear of losing situational awareness at critical moments, a confidence that translates directly into combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel John Mayer, commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, reports that the bubble canopy has fundamentally changed the psychology of aerial combat, eliminating the constant anxiety about unseen threats that plagued pilots in earlier fighters, allowing them to focus entirely on offensive action knowing they can see any developing threat, a mental advantage that proves as decisive as any performance specification in determining combat outcomes. The Dallas production facility reaches peak output by October 1944, with P-51DS rolling off the assembly line at a rate of 1 every hour, each aircraft featuring the revolutionary bubble canopy that has transformed aerial warfare, while German production of Bf-109s and FW-190s, despite desperate efforts to increase output, cannot compensate for the tactical disadvantage their pilots face when engaging opponents who can see everything around them. Luftwaffe night fighter units report that even in low light conditions, the bubble canopy provides superior visibility compared to conventional designs, because the unobstructed view allows pilots to make maximum use of available light, tracking targets against the night sky that would be invisible through the multiple frames and panels of German canopies, an advantage that extends the P-51D's dominance into conditions where German pilots had previously held advantage. The impact on German industrial planning becomes apparent as resources are diverted from fighter production to increasingly desperate wonder weapon projects. Partly because conventional fighters have proven unable to compete with bubble canopy Mustangs regardless of performance improvements, forcing a recognition that incremental advancement cannot overcome the revolutionary advantage that American industry has achieved through superior manufacturing capability. Major George Peter Eder of Jagdgeschwader II, with over 70 victories, submits a combat report describing his first encounter with P-51DS, noting with professional admiration how American pilots maintain perfect formation spacing while maneuvering violently, each pilot able to track his wingmen through any evolution simply by turning his head, while German formations disintegrate into individual combats as pilots lose sight of each other through their restricted canopies. The bubble canopy's influence extends to post-war aircraft design as captured German engineers study P-51D specimens in detail, recognizing that future fighter aircraft must incorporate similar all-around visibility to remain competitive, lessons that will influence jet fighter design for decades to come, establishing the bubble canopy as an essential feature of any serious combat aircraft rather than merely an American innovation. November 1944 witnesses the effective collapse of organized Luftwaffe fighter resistance over Western Europe, with many units unable to mount effective operations against P-51D escorted bomber streams, their pilots refusing suicidal missions against opponents who hold every advantage from performance and numbers to the crucial ability to maintain constant visual awareness of the tactical situation, a demoralization that spreads throughout the service. The Japanese military attaché in Berlin, Colonel Takashiro Hattori, transmits a final assessment to Tokyo warning that the P-51D's bubble canopy represents a technological leap that Japan cannot hope to match with current industrial capabilities, recommending that fighter tactics be completely revised to account for opponents who will possess superior situational awareness in any engagement, advice that proves prophetic as B-29 bombers escorted by bubble canopy Mustangs begin appearing over the Japanese homeland. Italian pilots of the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, flying their final missions alongside the Luftwaffe in northern Italy, report that engaging P-51DS feels like fighting an opponent with supernatural awareness, their bubble canopies allowing them to track multiple threats while maintaining offensive pressure, a capability that renders traditional defensive tactics useless and forces pilots to accept unfavorable odds simply to survive long enough to disengage. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium's final technical assessment of the bubble canopy, compiled in December 1944, acknowledges that this single innovation has contributed more to Allied air superiority than any performance advantage, because it multiplies the effectiveness of every pilot and aircraft equipped with it, transforming aerial combat from a three-dimensional chess game where positioning determines advantage to a contest where superior awareness trumps traditional tactical skill. Production statistics from North American Aviation's year-end report show that over 8,000 P-51DS have been manufactured, with production accelerating despite the obvious approaching end of the war, each aircraft giving Allied forces an insurmountable advantage in aerial combat, the bubble canopy having proven so decisive that no amount of German technical innovation or tactical adaptation can restore the balance. As 1945 dawns, Luftwaffe pilots face the grim reality that the skies over Germany belong to bubble canopy Mustangs, whose pilots patrol with impunity, secure in their ability to see any threat before it develops, while German pilots huddle on their airfields, knowing that taking off means accepting combat where the enemy can see everything while they struggle to glimpse fragments of the tactical picture through the prison of their restricted canopies. General der Jagdflieger Gordon Golub, Gallen's successor, issues a frank assessment to Göring stating that the bubble canopy has rendered the Luftwaffe's fighter force combat ineffective not through superior performance but through superior situational awareness, allowing American pilots of modest skill to consistently defeat German veterans who cannot leverage their experience against opponents who see every move before it develops. The final months of the war in Europe see P-51D pilots achieving victory tallies that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier, with some American aces scoring 5 or more kills in single missions, success enabled primarily by their ability to maintain continuous awareness of multiple targets while German pilots struggle to track even single opponents through their fragmented field of view, a disparity that transforms aerial combat from contest to slaughter. Japanese Army Air Force commanders preparing for the defense of the homeland study German combat reports with growing alarm, recognizing that their fighters, despite superior maneuverability, will face the same disadvantage against bubble canopy Mustangs, forcing consideration of desperate measures including kamikaze tactics that abandon traditional combat entirely in favor of suicidal ramming attacks that require no tactical sophistication. The Italian Social Republic's final combat reports, before the collapse of Axis resistance in northern Italy, describe P-51D formations operating with a coordination and tactical flexibility that seems almost telepathic, their pilots maintaining perfect spacing and mutual support through complex maneuvers that would leave conventional fighter formations in chaos, a capability directly attributable to the unlimited visibility provided by their revolutionary canopies. March 1945 brings the deployment of P-51DS to Iwo Jima, where they begin very long-range missions escorting B-29 superfortresses to Japan, their bubble canopies proving especially valuable during the 7-hour missions where pilot fatigue would normally degrade situational awareness, but the ease of maintaining visual scan patterns through the unobstructed canopy reduces workload and preserves combat effectiveness even after hours of flight. Japanese fighter pilots encountering P-51DS over the homeland report the same phenomenon German pilots discovered a year earlier, that attacking these bubble canopy fighters means engaging an opponent who sees everything, tracks every move, and responds with perfect tactical awareness to any attack angle, forcing Japanese pilots to abandon carefully developed tactics in favor of desperate frontal attacks that rarely succeed against the Mustang's .650 caliber machine guns. The final Luftwaffe assessment of the bubble canopy's impact, compiled from surviving combat reports and pilot interviews, concludes that this single innovation cost Germany air superiority over Europe, because while the Luftwaffe could match or exceed American aircraft performance in many respects, they could never overcome the fundamental disadvantage of fighting opponents who possessed complete visual awareness while their own pilots remained partially blind. Lieutenant General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, states in his final combat assessment that the bubble canopy proved more valuable than any performance improvement, because it gave every P-51D pilot the situational awareness previously reserved for exceptional aces, democratizing the skills that separate survivors from statistics in aerial combat, an advantage that no amount of enemy courage or skill could overcome. The Focke-Wulf TA-152, Germany's final attempt to create a fighter capable of competing with the P-51D, incorporates a slightly improved canopy design but still falls far short of the bubble canopy's unlimited visibility, condemning even this advanced fighter to the same tactical disadvantage that doomed its predecessors, a limitation that symbolizes the broader technological gap that American industrial superiority has created. As Berlin falls in May 1945, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's earlier observation proves prophetic, for when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the jig was up, not just because American fighters could reach the capital, but because their bubble canopies gave them an insurmountable tactical advantage that transformed aerial combat, turning the Luftwaffe from the world's most feared air force into target practice for American pilots who could see everything while German pilots flew half-blind, through the restricted vision of their obsolete canopies. The Pacific War continues for several more months, with bubble canopy P-51DS systematically destroying Japanese air power through the same visibility advantage that crushed the Luftwaffe, their pilots maintaining perfect situational awareness while Japanese pilots in their conventionally canopied fighters struggle with the same blind spots that doomed their German allies, a technological disparity that helps ensure American air superiority through the final battles. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concludes that the bubble canopy contributed more to achieving air superiority than any other single technical innovation, because it addressed the fundamental challenge of aerial combat, which is maintaining awareness of threats and opportunities in three-dimensional space, an advantage that multiplied the effectiveness of every other capability the P-51D possessed, from its Packard Merlin engine to its exceptional range. The legacy of the bubble canopy extends far beyond World War II, establishing all-around visibility as an essential requirement for any fighter aircraft, a standard that influences design through the jet age and beyond, because the lesson learned in the skies over Germany was clear and unambiguous, that in aerial combat, the pilot who sees first usually wins, and the bubble canopy ensures its pilot always sees first. German veterans interviewed years after the war consistently identify the bubble canopy as the innovation that defeated them, not because it made the P-51D faster or more maneuverable, but because it gave American pilots the ability to see everything happening around them, maintaining tactical awareness that allowed them to exploit every advantage while denying German pilots the opportunity to use their hard-won experience and skill against opponents who could track their every move. The final production tallies show that North American aviation manufactured over 15,000 Mustangs of all variants, with the bubble canopy P-51D representing the definitive version that broke the Luftwaffe's back, each aircraft giving its pilot unprecedented situational awareness that transformed aerial combat from a contest of skill and courage to a technologically determined outcome where superior visibility meant survival and restricted vision meant death. In retrospect, the bubble canopy represents more than just a technical innovation. It symbolizes the broader American advantage in production technology and industrial capacity that allowed them to identify a tactical need, develop a revolutionary solution, and mass-produce it in quantities that overwhelmed enemy forces, while Germany's technically sophisticated but industrially constrained aviation industry could only watch helplessly as their pilots were systematically destroyed by opponents, who could see everything while they remained partially blind. The North American P-51D Mustang's bubble canopy thus stands as one of the decisive innovations of the Second World War, a simple concept, giving pilots unrestricted visibility, executed through sophisticated manufacturing techniques that only American industry could master at scale, creating a tactical advantage so profound that it rendered obsolete 4 years of German fighter development and tactical refinement in a matter of months, proving that in aerial warfare the ability to see determines the ability to survive, and the bubble canopy ensured that American pilots could always see while their enemies flew in partial darkness, searching desperately for threats that had already seen them, tracked them, and moved in for the kill.